Speech says, here.
During the invasion of Iraq, when Michael Moore went to Capitol Hill to ask congressmen whether they would sign their own children up for warfare, he was thrown out of the building because the idea that the people who sent us to war could be asked to bear any of the costs of the horrific decisions they made was just laughable to the leaders of the United States. We get two things on side government we want to solve for with this motion. First, we think we get a better calculus for when we get interventions, specifically limiting all of the terrible and nefarious interventions that have been common in the past. Second, we think we resist the entrenchment of misfortune and class divides through the perpetuation of the war machine, because we often tell you that it is not those of political privilege who end up fighting these wars, it is those from most misfortune backgrounds. How are we going to do this? What is our model, first off? So we think that when we say a lottery that would require conscription, anytime there is an intervention, we're talking about things like Syria, anytime you want to use soldiers, things like that, anytime you want to go into Iraq, any of those, you would need to have conscription to fill any of the military ranks, not just boots on the ground. You'd have training and stuff like that that goes beforehand with that, that's okay. Next, we would say that the lottery is completely random. It just, everyone has the same chance of getting selected. The only thing we're going to take into account is, like the Israeli model, there would be certain religious objections potentially that we would take into account. The big thing is, though, if you have no outstanding circumstances that can't get you sent to war, you have just as good a chance as everyone else. First off, why do we think we get the best calculus for interventions under our side of the house? The first thing we have to establish is that it will not be impossible to have an intervention on our side of the house. There are times when people are willing to use a military or even are willing to open themselves up for conscription. However, that bar would be incredibly, incredibly high. You would actually need to point out basically ridiculous human rights abuses of a scale beyond what Bashar al-Assad did, for example, if you actually wanted any form of conscription. Why do we think this is a good thing, first off? A lot of the time, even when we highly object to the kinds of things we intervene on, we just see negative results coming out of it. Look what's going on in Syria right now. None of us may like Bashar al-Assad, but the only reasonably successful intervention against ISIS was the Russian-led airstrikes against ISIS, which actually seemed to consolidate his power. So a lot of the interventions that the West has proposed, even if for good ends, are hasty, they do not achieve their ends, and most importantly, if people were aware that they would be the ones potentially asked to bear the cost, were they to support this, maybe their children will be sent, also conscription, obviously not from like 60-year-olds, some reasonable range of age is in there as well, then at that point you would be less likely to get involved in these kinds of interventions unless the human rights abuse being spoken of is so drastic that you actually think understanding the limitations of intervention is still the best course of action.
Don't you believe the better check, though, is that when people don't sign up for particular missions, it is automatically a check to that government that perhaps this mission is unpopular or likely not to be successful?
A couple of problems with that POI. One, it assumes that just because people don't voluntarily sign up for this mission, there is going to be a lack of people they can use to supply their army. No, it's called predatory practices, in which they conscript people. They lie to people aggressively to get them to fill out their ranks. That's why we were able to be in Iraq for as long as we were. Second, if you think that the check you need is not enough people signing up, well, guess what? You're just going to get shittier military interventions when you use an ineffective small army that the populace is still voted for because they're unaware of how many people will sign up for the military at any given moment. Okay, next. So, now that we still get the good kinds of interventions, why do we not get the bad kinds? First off, there are massive reasons and incentives for politicians and electorates to go through with bad war missions. First off is just business incentives, right? Like Halliburton had a lot to do with the specific carrying out of the Iraq intervention, and the reason, for example, that Donald Rumsfeld ordered the UN to declare the burning of oil fields a war crime. I will tell you that a lot of the time, the actual interventions are not just motivated by human rights concerns. It would be great if our governments were wonderful people, but a lot of the time, especially in the case of the most intervention-happy governments like the United States, they are on the take from private interests such as private military contractors who have an inherent interest in extended conflict. The problem is there's a principal-agent problem here, in which these politicians can personally benefit from giving into the wills of the military-industrial complex and profiting further in their political career off of this, but themselves know that they come from a political class that will largely insulate them from any of the real costs of warfare. Not just having your kids sent to warfare, but also a lot of the real political costs of warfare. Why? Because the very people they send to war are largely the politically disenfranchised who do a bad job speaking out against them until long after the fact. If they knew that conscription was what they would have to force on the nation to give into something like Albert's demand to intervene in Iraq, then I think they would, one, be unable to do this, not just because they fear their own kids might be the ones who now may be sent to war, and that's a real cost to them, but second, the cost of asking your country to bear conscription means you need amazing justification for this. Not only do you need amazing justification for this, but on top of that, if you want to ever be politically alive, you would need to inform people as to exit plans, for example. Something that was never once discussed with Iraq when we intervened was how are we going to end this? If people knew that if this war goes on forever, their children will be conscripted and down the line, and they need something to save their lives, that's why we think it's good. That means if we get fewer of these interventions, we get fewer quagmires, fewer endless death, we get fewer pursuit of regime change that leads to more inherent collapse like we saw in Afghanistan. And most importantly, it is just principally not okay to play with house money when you are dealing with real people's lives and families, and the outcome isn't immediately identifiable as always being a greater positive than that, in the case of many of the interventions. Why is it not principally okay? Well, it also leads to massive practical harms. This is getting into my second argument about resisting the entrenchment of political influence. So, they only offer one POI, by the way. It is mostly the disenfranchised who get sent to war. Why is this? Because they don't have many other options. They're offered things like college education if they sign up for the military, and a lot of the time they are outright lied to. Here's the problem with trying to check for these lies. Insofar as you pay military recruiters to recruit people, and you pay them more if they do a good job, and the state, as Swish points out, wants soldiers to fill out their ranks, they have no incentive or reliable mechanism to stop people from claiming Shaggy was in the military and got a record deal through it and signing tons of people up in the military outside a mall like that, right? They do shit like this. So here's the problem when you have the most politically disenfranchised being the ones filling out the 90% of your military ranks. Number one, they get screwed out of benefits unlike anyone we've ever seen before. Look at the way we treat veterans. Do you know why veterans get nothing better coming to them? Because they are largely made up of the politically disenfranchised. You can't actually have the political sway to make a change to help veterans in the first place. If you send the most disenfranchised, you can shift most of the costs onto them and not deal with these people. Second, these people are already poor in large part. They come back with horrible disabilities and aren't able to work and live their families out of poverty. Because of that, you've entrenched the political disenfranchisement that kept them there in the first place. And you get a never-ending cycle driven by the war machine that keeps some people in poverty. We are against this. It's unjust.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. Would invite the leader opposite Julia to introduce the case for side opposition with another segment of address. Here.
I'm actually not convinced that fewer interventions is necessarily a good thing. I think often there is a bar where we absolutely should militarily intervene, even if that is less than less frequently than we intervene under status quo. The mechanism by which that decision is made is now just public deliberation out of fear that it might be your brother or your sister who gets drafted into the military. That is bad. That is a distortion of strategic decisions that should be taken in a much more technocratic light. And we end up with worse interventions in their side of the house, but also crazy military jingoism that I think is a bad thing and leads to a much less rational discussion over what is the most effective kind of military engagement in any sort of international conflict. So sometimes we do need to intervene. Also, I just like to I can get into this later, but I just like to flag what we heard out of Melbourne, which is that only if there's genocide happening now is the public going to be down to intervene. I think that people don't make the calculus of whether or not they want their persons or to run the risk of personally or someone they know being involved in the military based on the well-being of the Rwandans. I do think people like to see themselves as fighting for the United States. So I think the rhetoric has to be from about the interests of the host country, the United States. I think that leads to a worse kind of military discussion on their side of things. So that's bad. Also, I have 3 POIs during that speech. So, okay. So first of all, on the principle. We don't stand for drafting people. I think it's a tremendous and inexcusable infringement on someone's body rights. I think even if these are prolonged conflicts, they are not sufficient, severe existential threats to the state to warrant conscription. No citizen of a liberal democratic country should be forced to risk or give their life. The absolute right to life is the most absolute right that we have. It is the right that every other right is designed to protect. I think there's a fundamental importance that we do not cause citizens to even risk their lives when they haven't made that decision. I think that is far too much for the state to ask of anyone. I think drafting is always wrong. In addition to that, and I'll take you a little bit so yeah, don't grab people. In addition to that, I also think lotteries are bad. So we have two sort of underlying ideas under the Prime Minister about why the lottery mechanism is better than other kinds of draft. The first is an implicit idea of fairness, right? It's that like if it could be anyone, that it seems like the risk is spread out, the harm is spread out more equally in society than when it is filtered through other mechanisms, like his complaint of classism. Why is this not more fair? Because under status quo, if you believe that poor people can make decisions at all and have political opinions at all, the amount to like the degree to which someone participates in the military is scaled to the degree of investment they have in military intervention and the degree to which they approve of it. So by joining the military, you are making a decision that military action is okay and something you are willing to participate in. What particularly does this mean? Okay, so like the worthiness of any particular cause that you might participate in, so any particular military conflict, or like instance of nationalism, for example, the appropriateness of military action at all as a mechanism or in a particular case, and the willingness to invest your personal accountability in military action. These are all decisions that people make when they join the military. We allow people to self-select under status quo. Unless the problem is we literally don't have enough soldiers, I think it is ideal that the people who are in this position are people who have chosen to be there based on these criteria. It is the fairest way to make that decision. It also allows people to self-determine in a way that I think is profoundly important. So don't force this on people. That seems bad. And lottery can solve for that because in their side, like on their side of the house, people don't get access to that decision in the lottery system. That is not more fair, even if it is more equally distributed. That is a good metric for fairness. Okay, so how does that compare to the classism sort of complaints that we hear out of the Prime Minister? This is doing a little bit of, I guess, clarification now. Okay, couple problems. Their method of being like a conscientious objector, I think, will be frequently used on their side of the house. I think lots and lots of people really don't want to go into the military. I do think it is most available to people who are well-educated and well-connected. So I actually think there's a huge element of classism insofar as you can opt out if you can convince them that you are legitimately opting out. You're most able to do that when you're better educated, probably richer, perhaps more epistemically appealing, and certainly better connected.
Okay, so on your side of the house, you're really concerned about protecting the body rights of American soldiers and not that concerned about the victims of the American military when they go into, bad interventions.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that we're, okay, actually I'm going to move on to this right now, consequences, but I'm not sure that we're going to get either fewer interventions, even if that was a good thing, or better and better considered interventions on their side of the house, because the rhetoric around what constitutes a legitimate military engagement changes in a way that's really bad, because it gets personal and emotional and becomes a public decision and not like much less strategic. I think that leads to worse interventions. So, okay, what are the consequences? Public investment in militarism. I think, basically, the idea is that sometimes you do need to intervene. I think that I'm not entirely sure about their empirical claim that there are too many interventions in the status quo. But I do think that the decision to intervene, and particularly the length of intervention, ought to be an entirely strategic decision in terms of what the most efficient kind of engagement is. I think the most just war is the most efficient and effective war. I will take you, but not right now. And I think that these have to be decisions that are largely technocratic, and it's okay also if they're bureaucratic and not entirely made by democracy. I think the democratic mechanism in this case is actually particularly liable to skewing. When the Prime Minister talks to you about like the interests who have in the past, like Lockheed Martin or whatever, that have in the past skewed this in order to like err towards too much intervention, those still exist and they still have a ton of power. So if we're looking at anything like lobbying public opinion, the vast majority of the public now feels more personally invested in military intervention, but I do think that they're also more emotional and liable to sway as a result of that. And I think the actors that are most likely to be able to capitalize that are these like military industrial actors that already have a ton of money and on the platform. So I actually don't think that we necessarily get better decisions on their side of the house. I also think it's likely, I'll take you about 10 seconds, I think it's likely that we get increased things like either jingoism or excessive caution. I think people are liable to fall into the swing of public opinion, neither being excessively nationalistic and like, yes, go get the bad guys, or being excessively cautious because it is a direct threat to you or someone you know. And I think either of those things are not ideal in terms of making military decisions.
Okay, so a lot of the American political scene right now is about ramping up the threat of ISIS in the Middle East. You think they could justify a war, but an American security interest, if most people in the US go, I'm not willing to let my kid die to protect
I am not totally convinced that intervening in the Middle East is the absolute wrong way to deal with ISIS. Sometimes probably there do have to be boots on the ground. I think it's a lot harder sometimes on their side of the house. And the way that that decision is made doesn't have to do with whether or not it would be effective. It has to do with whether or not people feel scared about it, or especially nationalistic about it. That mechanism gets worse on their side of the house because people have this personal emotional investment. I think it's better to deploy the military as an instrument full of people who like have chosen to be there. Okay, so that's bad. It gets more rhetorical and much less rational. And Julia's going to talk about this more, but sometimes drafted soldiers are just like not super effective. I think there are people who aren't necessarily invested in it. I think there are people who don't necessarily have the right kind of mental preparation, especially if it's a lottery. You didn't know that you were necessarily going to be the one who was picked for it. I think you probably aren't as effective a soldier, and I think we don't want to be filling our ranks with people who didn't want to be there and aren't particularly good at it. What did we hear? Lots of stuff. Hopefully I'm mostly read most of it, otherwise Julia's going to get to it. But yeah, we think it's really unfair that you infringe on someone's body rights in this way. Drafting is always wrong. This is a particularly ineffective way of doing it that actually just magnifies all the kind of bad rhetoric and political dialogue that you understand. That's a great help with us.
Thank you, Leader, for the remarks. We'd like the Deputy Prime Minister Denizen to conclude the case for side opening government to the Senate address. Here.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. So I think we on opening government have won this today because we've presented two very clear themes that I think are going to carry out throughout this round. First, we've proven to you that wars and the way we use our military and the way we engage in foreign interventions, specifically practically, are going to be better implemented on our side of the house. And we've heard very little refutation to that claim until the last 30 seconds of the speech. I hope to hear more from the other Julia. Unfortunately, we won't be able to respond to that. But secondly, equally importantly, we've told you why it's principally unjustifiable for us to use politicians who bear none of the cost of actually going to war, but to make huge gains by playing into huge lobby groups in the military, by sending poor black people to go to war. Right? I think it's principally unjustifiable if they don't bear any of the cost of going to war itself to actually make that decision. I want to deal with all of the arguments coming outside, opposition, in turn, and then rebuild my partner's case. So first argument, and I think this is pretty, that is the first justifiable, the principal claim they make, is that it's bad for conscription itself is unjustifiable because it's an unjustifiable violation of individual body rights, therefore it's not principally acceptable. Unfortunately, in the current status quo that my partner lays out to you, we don't have a fair recruitment process that she explains in her second argument, right? When she says that, oh, people should be able to self-select into the military and therefore have self-determination. That's unfortunately not the reality we live in. And she makes a crazy overgeneralization when she says that, oh yeah, if you believe poor people have any agency at all. Well, that's not the comparative or the reality or any of the nuance my partner brings you, right? It's not about the binary of whether you have agency or not, right? It's about the kinds of pressures that are implemented, not just by society, but by the government and the military, specifically to target these people and to recruit them unfairly into the military. What are those things that we heard in her response to, right? These people literally come from the poorest backgrounds, right? Like often the military is the only job they can get in the first place because there are no jobs around because they don't get any funding for schools, for example, right? But then in their terrible school where there's a ton of crime and gang violence and drugs, the military shows up in nice press uniforms and says, you can save your country, we'll also pay for your college, and then you join up to fight for a war where you have no information on where you're going or what war you're fighting for, right? So not only is there a problem in terms of power between these two groups, but there's also huge information asymmetries where you don't know what war you're fighting for, whether or not you actually believe in what the military is doing, right? So I don't understand how they can possibly claim this is a fair situation, right? So insofar as you have to believe that there's some level of predatory targeting, and insofar as you have paid patriotism, for example, where you literally have jets flying over football games to show the world how the military is the greatest thing ever, or you have military families which tell their kids that the best thing that they can possibly do is go and fight for your country. All of these people grouped together are people who don't self-select into the military, but have huge pressures put on them, right? So when, for example, she tells you that she wants technocrats to come and make these kinds of decisions, I think she has to realize that the technocrat, it's not the fact that we don't believe strategic wars are good or not, right? I think the problem is how we make those decisions in the the first place. So insofar as it's not the politicians, it's not the lobbyists, and it's not the business interests that are making these decisions, the decision to go to war, right? I think what you get is the same violation of body rights that they're afraid of on their side, but it happens way worse on their side of their house, right? So insofar as the claim from opening opposition is that body rights are the key principle that we must unfold, I think we protect that much better on our side of the house when you have a much fairer distribution of the actual impacts on this. So when we are violating people's body rights by actually sending them to war, because implicitly, like on either side, you're just going to have to do that by sending people into harm's way. On our side of the house, you don't have the principal-agent problem, the power asymmetry, so you have done much more fairly. Right? What I need to hear from side opposition, if any of them have any chance of winning this debate, is to prove why principally, and I'll take this in a second, it is fair and justified for a politician to make a decision to send people into war that he has unfairly recruited and bears no cost. Right? It's just principally unjustified to send people into harm's way when you're going to benefit from that decision, but then bear none of the cost to, right? I want to hear an answer to that moral hazard. We haven't heard one yet. Go ahead.
Predatory recruitment does happen, and it's bad. It is not the majority of cases in which soldiers sign up to go to war, and people should be afforded some, at least nominal choice over whether they choose to compromise their life in that way.
So it's an incredible assertion to say that's not the majority of the case. I can equally claim that's not the majority of the case. I guess we don't know. It depends on what you guys decide. But even if it's not the majority of the case, and if it's a minority, it's still principally unjustified, right? Like even if you're violating like a few poor black people's right to choice and you're predatory recruitment, it's equally as principally unjustified. And a fairer system is a much better way to go about this, right? And it can be principally justified. Sure.
Okay, but how do you solve the problem poor people not being able to deal with the consequences of coming back from war if they can't even opt out of it in the first place because they're susceptible to the lottery too?
Great point. I think we provide for much better veterans protections on our side of the house when the problems and the costs of going to war are better distributed fairly amongst people with power and without power, economically and politically. And that leads me perfectly to my partner's second arguments about how we get better practical implementations of military power, right? So just to respond to that, right? Insofar as my partner tells me that veterans are treated poorly because they all come from a lower political and economic caste in the United States and many other countries where they don't have the ability to reach out to politicians or even fund their own medical emergencies, right? They're treated much more terribly. But on our side of the house, you have a much fairer distribution of where these veterans are actually coming from, so you actually will have veterans who come from the upper class with political power who will actually advocate for better hospitals for the VA, for example, and things like that, so you get a better distribution. The response we get from this from side opposition is purely mitigatory when they say, oh yeah, well, conscientious objection means that rich people will more likely to be able to get out of this because they have more education. Yeah, sure, but that's purely mitigatory, right? Like we have some rich people who get out of it on our side. We have all of them get out on your side because none of them want to die. They want to run Goldman Sachs and then profit off the oil money by taking over Iraq, right? But even if it is true that conscientious objection is abused by rich people, imagine you're a politician like George W. Bush, for example, who wants to invade Iraq. How terrible does it look if your actual children are willing to use conscientious objector status, right? Like, it is not justifiable in that situation that the rich will always opt out, right? Like, if they believe in the war and they want to go for it, then we say it's going to be less abused and you're going to get a fair distribution. So, onto the argument they bring about how you have an unfair, implementation of war and how in some cases military interventions are justified, right? Here's the problem, right? There's no objective mechanism of determining when, we just can't figure out what interventions are going to be correct or not. The only thing we can possibly decide as a government is what the process is of actually coming to that conclusion, right? Their process is a bunch of technocrats that come from the, political class that have a ton of business interests, etc. So if their claim is the decision these individuals, the politicians, come to is going to be the fair and objective measure, and not the democratic will of the people who are actually who feel the brunt of the cost, I think they've lost that comparative on the whole, right? So on our side, even if it is our argument that you do get less military interventions, and it's not just we're willing to bite the harm that sometimes we don't go to war when we need to, but the point is you get a more democratic will being put forward because people actually have to make the decision, and when the cost that people are feeling when they go to war is actually being interpreted by politicians and a part of the decision. That's why we believe we get better interventions and we get better protections for crowd.
And then speaker their remarks, we invite the deputy leader opposite, Julia, to conclude the front half of the debate. The other side of the press, you're here.
we are to have more just interventions, and interventions that occur on the basis of effectiveness and are not done by narratives of fear, I don't think anything the side government is proposing today can stand. What I'm going to do for you today is provide a third argument about individual effectiveness and why that's important with several subpoints underneath it, and then run through some refutation of government, specifically focusing on the calculus of intervention, so I think what kinds of interventions we are more or less likely to see, and second of all, about principles and who is going to be the kind of this force in general. So first of all, about individual effectiveness. I think so far this debate has centered around systems, and systems of political classes, and systems of people and citizens. But recognizing that those systems, specifically the systems of war and the people who go into them fighting as an integrated unit, are made up of individuals. So when things go wrong, it is most likely that those things break from the bottom. It's not usually top-up command structures of the problem. It's individual people, individual soldiers who feel unprepared, mentally unsupported, unable to seek out resources, and oftentimes feel as though they have no capacity to be an effective soldier and do not want to be there. I think most specifically, this policy removes the ability for effective mental resilience, that means you're going to have less effective individuals resulting in a less effective system. First subpoint. I think that the consent to being a citizen does not equal the consent to being a soldier unless you live in a state that has constitutionally been decided and voted on by the citizenry. I think that unless you know that being a citizen of your state means that you are going to be somebody who physically fights to protect it and not just contribute to the state in the form of other ways, things like taxation, things like voting, other things that we think are important to the state, then we don't recognize that supporting that state can exist in multiple different ways. And I think that you don't provide things for freedom to determine what your own life looks like. So secondly though, should you choose to opt into the system, which I think we have fully supported down the bench today, should you actually choose to limit your lifespan, your life quality, the connections with your family, your physical and mental health for the duration of your life, I think that you deserve some kind of freedom within those constraints you have placed on what your life looks like to live a meaningful life within that. I think that when you consent to that process, what that means then is you have a better idea of what will likely impact you and your ability to understand your own life and the people around you. When you are drafted, that I think means you live in a state of perpetual fear, which means you are a less effective individual in your own life. But moreover, I think it means you don't make the active choice to limit those kinds of things, meaning you get less individual freedom overall. Thirdly, though, what does being drafted do to effectiveness? I think it really creates a kind of fear and resentment and is not going to have the kinds of cohesive groups that we want. So if side opening government wants there to be a milieu of races and classes all somehow working together, they provided no mechanism for how the military that has done so horribly in the past of integrating people of different races and different genders together into different groups and supporting people when they have those kinds of problems to create those kinds. So I think if they can't deal with that under status quo, there has to be some other kind of mechanism they can do it now. Sure.
So the military, by bringing women into the military and black-owned units in World War II, was in the forefront of a lot of civil rights fights. What are you talking about? They're often better than society in integrating different groups.
What I'm saying is that these minorities face specific problems within these structures, and I think if you're going to bring them in under this kind of water without specific systems to support them in that kind of integration, recognizing that things like sexual assault against women within the military are things where they can't speak out and can't do anything about that because there aren't any kinds of system of support, they have to do a much better job of providing why you as an individual are going to have a positive military experience, otherwise the people would simply never consent to that. But finally though, I think that this is beyond just the decision to go to war and while you were at war, recognizing you're going to be less effective while you were fighting, but also when you come back. Because when they talk about veterans and PTSD and systems of support for reintegration, I think those are things that you have to preemptively be able to understand and know how to access. And I think that there isn't the kind of political support for those under their side of the house because there isn't a kind of collective advocacy. Because when you don't actually brand yourself as somebody who has made the career decision to become a fighter for your state, I think that it is less likely to have collective action to reach the kinds of political ends to get support for veterans in PTSD. So now let's talk about some refutation. But first I'll take a few I can back up. I've already taken one from your team.
Yeah, so if you're right and people think that it's really inhumane for individuals to be sent away when they have no idea what's going to happen to them during war, don't you think that that mobilizes political will to help veterans because they didn't consent to that and didn't choose it?
I don't think that's the mechanism, though, that you want to have for the kind of veteran support, right? Like, if you actually want real, continued, and sustained support, it should happen because you recognize that people are making an individual contribution to the state that ought to be rewarded because they are citizens and because they have served the state. That's a better mechanism. So first of all, this kind of calculus for intervention and what kind of things you're going to get. So opening government wants us to fight against human rights abuses and thinks that those are the kinds of times that we should really be having intervention. I don't think on their side of the house you're ever going to be able to fight for those kinds of wars. Why? Because people never vote to go to stage strangers, specifically when they don't look like them or talk like them or believe in the same things as them. That's why that's why there's no military intervention right now in South Sudan, even though their civil war is led to larger extent and larger damage than we're seeing in the Middle East. People in the United States will only ever go to war if they think that they themselves and the rhetoric of the state and terrorism is at danger. So I think on their side of the house, if they ever want those kinds of interventions, it's going to change the narrative to a specific state benefit. And when that becomes the narrative, you get less nuanced discourse, less actual discussions of the harms of going into these wars. So you get worse interventions, more hostile interventions that are not necessarily for the will of the people, but for the interests of the state. So then they talk to you about these insulated political classes, several responses. So if the system actually works and you get like a representative of the population, recognize that if the 1% of the political elite are indeed that small, that means that the vast majority of soldiers anyway are still going to be poor black minorities, right? So you're still only going to have 1% of people fighting being from those political classes. So even if their system works perfectly, the way the numbers work out mean that you're not going to have the same kind of equal representation that they would want for you. But secondly, I don't think they've given you any reason to see why these self-interested political elites would be so willing to submit themselves to a system that would not advantage them. I think it's far more likely, if you believe in state interest, that these people are going to have the power to sway lottery policies to make sure that their children go into less dangerous conflicts because they're the ones who are running them. I also think it creates a rhetoric of being unfair that doesn't solve the kind of political harm. Finally, in terms of this idea of recruitment, I honestly don't think they're doing anything to reform the core problems of military recruitment. But secondly, though, what I would say is that if you are an individual and the state has offered you no education and no job opportunities, and you can meaningfully make the choice to go into the military, knowing that it is going to provide you a paycheck, is going to provide you university, that's a meaningful choice that you should be able to make and not something that side government can tell you is coercive and against your will. I think in terms, finally, of this idea of principles for politicians bearing no cost. They bear the cost if things go wrong. They're accountable to the people. They have interest in the state. A lot of them have been involved in the military before. We think they do have the interest in the people at heart. So.
And thank you, Speaker, for the remarks. We'll invite the member from Side Government, Hazelton, to introduce the case for backup. Here.
Honorable Speaker, I think that the extension that Lex and I are going to deliver to you is going to win because it doesn't rely on us proving that we are going to get more or less intervention. It's about what happens when we're there and how the soldiers behave when we are in active combat and why we think it's better when you have this kind of policy. I'm going to talk to you about two things. The first, the narrative that the U.S. military or other militaries around the world spin when they have to incentivize people to stay. And the second, why those who elect to be in combat are oftentimes more interested in violence than sometimes people who would perhaps be more compassionate in active combat, and why we think that's a good check on the actual behavior of individuals, which is why opening government doesn't want us to intervene as much. It's not because like the interventions themselves have been like unequivocally bad, it's because they've been carried out in really detrimental ways. And then I'll get into a lot of refutation about everything that we hear from OO. So first of all, let's deal with the narrative that people spin and the military spins when they have to incentivize people to stay in the military. So it's true that they say we can give you a paycheck and we can give you education, but it can't just be that, right? Giving away your life is a huge sacrifice for you individually. Oftentimes that's why you look at the way that the military ends up recruiting people, and it's by saying that you get to hold guns, that you have a massive amount of power, that you are seriously on the front lines in a place where you would have more autonomy than you would ever have anywhere else. That's another additional reason why they're able to prey on those particular individuals. They ramp up that kind of power, and they ramp up the idea that fighting is going to be really great, that the violence that you are going to experience is going to be in the hands of a military that is incredibly strong, and that you are going to be able to be part of one of those particular industries. And that is true for regardless of what kind of person you are, but that can permeate how you feel when you're in war. If you're trained because the U.S. military has to keep you there, that it's going to be good and that you can shoot whoever you want and that that's going to be something that's good, that permeates how you're going to behave when you're overseas specifically. And I think that that's necessarily bad, and they don't have that incentive under our side of the house because they are going to have soldiers regardless. So I just don't think that the narrative spinning and telling you about the American military and how great it is and why you should be there needs to happen under that particular under our particular side of the house. But more importantly, I think that those who are conscripted are less likely to be interested in engaging in violence. And that was one of the reasons why they said that they were going to be bad soldiers. But I think that that's a really great check on the kinds of people that you bring overseas to fight in active combat. One of the main problems that we end up having is that there's no check on an individual who's just happy, like, firing away at the person who might be a kid that hasn't done anything wrong. If you are more compassionate and didn't want to be there in the first place, you might hesitate in those instances, and we're happy with that happening, right? I think a big problem is that the people who elect to go to war want to be at war in the first place. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see massive human rights abuses by the militaries themselves. Not just the fact that not just the fact that the war is existing, but the militaries themselves are bad. And this doesn't just mean that there are going to be a lot more problems with human rights abuses there. That means that you completely erode the idea of the American military or intervention as being in service of people, because there aren't a whole lot of people, or there are a lot of people there who just don't care about the fact that those individuals might be harmed, that are happy, shooting when those individuals might be innocent civilians. And I think that having that check and having those people work together means that you're probably more likely to get people who are compassionate. That also, I think, permeates the decision not just to go into war, but I think that permeates the decisions of what you do when you're there from the public's aspect. Because yeah, we think like there is public discussion about going into war with the big ticket items, but following it as it happens, insofar as it's so far away, oftentimes doesn't happen. I think you're more likely to have the public catching, problems with the way that the military operates, overseas itself, when those individuals are there and when those individuals are or could be you as well. Yeah, right.
That's so true, because most people still aren't involved in war, but also violating like the command hierarchy is a super good way to get yourself killed. These people are often going to be worse soldiers, even if they're acting from altruistic motives.
Yeah, but you're assuming that the command hierarchy is also just going to be people who really, really like war. Like, you might want to be in the command of the American military because you have to be there, and perhaps you want to see the war carried out in a different particular way. And maybe the politicians are also going to want to see it carried out in a different particular way. And I think that that's necessarily important. But also, I'm not sure that it really matters if I'm not sure that I really care about the fact that you might not be shooting as many people as you would under the side of the house if you elected to go to war because you liked being there in the first place. Well, let's get into refutation now, and there's going to be a lot of new refutation here. So first of all, the affront to bodily rights. So they say, look, that you should never conscript people because they have not elected to do it, and your body rights are very important for you actualizing on what you want in all other aspects of life. First of all, I think that opening stands insofar as you oftentimes end up getting people who don't necessarily consent or know what's going to happen, or who know what's going to happen in war. Additionally, what we would provide you is that the problem is that you now have to blame those individuals who elected because they consented to what happened, right? The political will to help people afterwards isn't as great because those people knew what they were getting into, or perhaps they knew that it was a possibility that they were going to be involved in a mission that they didn't like, and they consented to it. And that's why it's so much worse for a person who we don't think has necessarily completely consented. But I think it's really important to have a place to fall back on when those individuals don't want to be there. No, but second of all, I think that this is just an argument. I don't think that this argument works insofar as war just doesn't respect body rights, period. Like, they're placing a premium on protecting body rights of American soldiers and don't particularly care about the fact that there are oftentimes victims in that country themselves that get their body rights affronted. Oftentimes there are going to be people who have not consented to what happens in war, and that simply happens. And I don't think you should place a premium on other individuals, especially when we think that they're more likely to protect the body rights of individuals when they're over there because they didn't place a premium on violence and wanting to go into the military in the first place.
Hazel, you said previously that it's good when soldiers use their discretion on the battlefield and decide, for example, not to shoot like innocent children. Why do they have to be on the battlefield to object to the war effort? Why can't they do that when they're back home in their host country and reject from voluntarily going into that war effort?
Because somebody's still there holding the gun and shooting somebody, right? They're assuming that people are following orders when they're shooting up a bunch of kids, right? No, you can sit home and somebody's still going to be there. Perhaps it's better if you're on the battlefield. But then they say people are going to lobby for public opinion to go to war. On their side of the house, that doesn't even need to happen. I think it's probably better that individuals do have to talk and do have to try and convince people to go to war. But let's look at what Julia says in terms of the individual effectiveness of people. She says that they're not going to be as good because you're in perpetual fear of your life in your just status quo existence. I just don't think that that necessarily is true insofar as you're referring to go to war. And if it is, I don't care because I think you're probably going to care more about learning about that war. But in terms of integration, I think that it's a really good way to integrate people when you rely on the black person next to you being good at their job or protecting you in order for your life to exist. That's a really good way to place importance on the lives of somebody you might not have had otherwise. But then the last thing I say is, look, it's not going to be the political elite that's there because apparently like the majority of the American population are poor black people. A, that's not true. But B, that 1%, we don't need the 1%, right? We can have a lot of middle-class people who are, not involved to make that particular type of change. So on the basis that we think that people
are going to have more checks on their particular actions in war. Why that's the most important, we get to Professor Lakes.
I thank the member for the remarks. We invite the member opposite to introduce the case for side closing opposition with another 7-minute address. Hear, hear.
Honourable Speaker, 3 points of extension before I get into rectification. Basins extension and everything else we heard down the bench of side argument. Firstly, about how this is an unnecessary change to the military. Secondly, about how this creates an effective military practically. And thirdly, about the importance of the ability to refuse military service and what that can serve both principally and practically in terms of military intervention. So, on to the first point about why this is unnecessary. Because what we can't fathom on side opposition is why any previous military intervention that the United States went under is necessarily would have been better if they had like more men at their disposal, right? We don't think that there's necessarily an issue of being able to not have enough willing soldiers who can complete the job adequately. We don't think that there is a problem with that. We think that if anything, that we see the change in things like drones being able to enlist voluntarily fills that requirement. So we think that overall this is just an unnecessary thing to be able to do. But moreover, what happens when you actually have, and what this doesn't necessarily affect the efficacy of the military, when you necessarily have people who don't want to be in the military, who don't have the same conviction as a voluntary soldier would. First of all, what you have is simply the rate of desertion, right? People don't want to be in that situation. If they never wanted to make a career in the military, they never wanted to be the type of person who fights for their nation, literally. We think that if anything, you're just going to increase the chances that you're going to have people who want to desert missions. You're going to have people with a low sense of morale that can impact and affect the rest of the troops that are serving with them. We think that's incredibly problematic to that as well. And moreover, what happens when people actually object to the mission, but they're still forced to serve? When they actually have concrete reasons as to why they don't think that their country, that the United States, should be serving in this way. It should be serving in Afghanistan, should be serving in Iraq, etc. What we then see is that there's more likely that they're going to want to act out against it, right? We see things like them actually trying to compromise the mission, not taking the actions that they're necessarily ordered to take. We think that not only can that be incredibly dangerous to themselves, not serving the military that's on their side necessarily, but moreover, they're putting the lives of their fellow soldiers at risk by being in that situation. We think that even if they want to make it more evenly distributed, what we think is that certain people, when they have this sort of bias against the military necessarily, are only going to make matters that much worse and are going to make the efficacy of the military and the ability to keep their own soldiers and their fellow teammates safe is going to be compromised when you have people with stringent objections to the war effort itself. Finally, what I wanted to add, sure.
ISIS is bad. Maybe we should intervene. Actually, a similar argument was used in Philippines, Vietnam, Central America, South Korea, Gulf I, Gulf II, and now Syria. The point we are making on government is that even if you buy this in this individual case, when you add up all the interventions, we are in a state of perpetual intervention. That is tons of death, tons of war. We would never consent to perpetual conscription.
Okay. But necessarily, so what we're going to say to that, and this actually goes into response to their earlier argument about the better conflicts, right? So that what you're necessarily going to see is that what you're doing at worst is going to make intervention necessarily impossible, right? It's only going to be based on public will, right? A lot of people just don't want to go to war, and that's perfectly fine. But an individual person's desire not to want to necessarily be and put their life at risk doesn't necessarily mean that that war effort isn't going to be effective and necessary in the long run. We think is that when you have that, all you're going to do is compromise the ability of the United States to ever want to intervene when situations are necessarily that bad. When we've seen that there's already a lack of will to be able to intervene in the case of Rwanda, in the case of Sudan. What we think is that if people's own lives are going to be at risk, they're only going to be further saying that that's not our problem, we shouldn't want to intervene. So, yeah, not being a perpetual intervention is great, but even the worst intervention, even the most necessary interventions that you would argue for on your side are going to be impossible to try and bring to fruition. No, next. So finally, about this idea about the ability to refuse, right? Because just as in their model when they talk about people being able to refuse on the grounds of religious objection, etc., what you think is that people who are against the war effort necessarily, the ones who might compromise the mission practically, are necessarily valid reasons not to have to engage in that military effort, right? Even if this is democratically and necessarily, even if this is the democratic will to be engaged in that war effort, that does not necessarily mean that you as an individual consented to be part of it in that in that respect, putting your own life on the line necessarily. What we think is that people who objected to the war overall in the first place can still be subject to the conscription that follows. We think that's incredibly infringing upon their own bodily rights, but also is contradictory to their own reason of saying that, yeah, if you have like a technical religious objection, then sure, you don't have to compete. But any individual moral objection you might have to a particular mission or political affiliation that you might have simply doesn't bear any weight under their model. But moreover, even if we did take these things into account, what it simply is incompatible with the order and command structure that militaries necessarily need in order to carry out their missions effectively, right? To be able to issue commands and know and count on their soldiers to serve their commanding officers, regardless of what they might think personally at the time, because they don't necessarily have all the information, because of the fact they're simply one person in a larger picture of the war effort. No thanks. So, what we also see is that the ability for soldiers to be able to refuse actually speaks volumes in their own respect, right? So if we see that no soldier wants to consent to this war, we think that's actually a beneficial check to be able to have on military command, right? If you don't have a willing public, you don't even have willing voluntary soldiers, we think that maybe they should take a better look at the military intervention that they're proposing in the first place. Sure.
In the status quo, there are a lot of people who compromise missions because they're trigger happy and they're violent. Even you say those individuals who don't want to be there will feel for their life as they deserve. Which would you rather have more of in the military? Defense?
I actually want to get right into your extension about saying about having like diversity of people is necessarily a good thing. It's going to prevent human rights abuses. That's just not necessarily true. Because first of all, you're going to still have those trigger happy people going into the military if they're going to exist. If anything, they are going to be checked by the pacifists who are next to them. If anything, you're going to have like some sort of hierarchy. They're not going to take orders from them, etc., etc. But moreover, we think is that hesitant soldiers aren't necessarily a good thing either, right? If you have someone who doesn't like conflict is put into a war, we think that's necessarily going to be a liability for them. But moreover, we think that the ability for people who oppose the mission to be able to compromise it from the inside is incredibly problematic. So we think that being able to have people who are voluntarily and have the morale and conviction behind going into a mission is necessarily important. But we don't think, and we think that similarly, while it might be nice to be able to have people who don't necessarily have that mentality, we think also things like drugs, etc., limit the ability for human rights abuse to happen because people are put into that position and they're able to compartmentalize better. But moreover, we see that by having people who are able to oppose a mission or going to act out against it within the military is a far greater liability to the potential of having sort of diversity of people. So what have we shown you so far today? What we've shown you on side opposition, on background particularly, is that this resolution, while necessarily being unnecessary in the first place, is also ineffective to the military command structure, but also compromises the ability for people to refuse military service, to refuse to put their bodies on the line for causes that they don't necessarily believe in. And it's for all these reasons that we proudly oppose.
I thank the Speaker for their remarks. We'll invite the Government Whip would like to conclude the round for inside government with the final government supplement address here.
I think that there are a couple of assumptions that the teams on opposition make about what narratives the public digests when they go to war that are particularly well impacted and well explained by Aislin's extension. Note that at the end of opposition's extension case, what you get is the idea that the people who go to war are just as likely to commit violent actions, in fact, just as likely to commit the kind of violent actions that are likely to have them subject to disciplinary action, because no pacifist in the military is going to stop them. Not only does Aislin's extension have a number of responses to that, but just off the bat, I think that those people are the people most likely to opt in a state where there is no conscription mechanism. Like, you are most likely to get the most violent people because they are the ones that buy the state narrative that that is what militaries are about, that that is how we conduct interventions, that power as held through guns is the effective reason why you should do those things. So I think that you do in fact get less of those people when conscription is a mechanism, just because the government needs to take less voluntary recruiters when they can fill their ranks with conscripts. A couple of points of reputation of the extension, and then I want to talk about states going to war and what kind of soldiers we get. The first thing they tell you is that numbers are not relevant. So a couple of reasons numbers are relevant. One, numbers are relevant because they are the reason that states shift what type of tactics they use. Note that in past years, the incentive to use less soldiers is what has led to more violent tactics like special ops forces or drone strikes or anything else. Like, the reason that war is as violent as they say is in fact the biggest harm to body rights is because we've shifted to a world where you cannot depend on having a conscripted force and fighting this as a battle of numbers. I think that much more violent actions against the people who they are having wars with and against, given that both opposition teams tell you we have some kind of duty to the people in whose countries these wars are being conducted, I think they do a meaningful disservice to those people when harm is incentivized on the part of states committing those actions because they don't need to expend as many of their own soldiers. Second, they tell you these people are just likely to compromise the mission. Okay, two massive problems with this. One, this is in huge tension with opening half that says they're too afraid of the command structure to do that, so that's kind of weird. But second of all, I think that assumes that these people are willing to, in the heat of the moment, take an action that will put their life at risk with no calculation of whether this is an instance worth their protest, right? So recognize that these people don't execute conscientious protest on the battlefield every time they object to something. That's why missions still have cohesion, even if individual soldiers who, by the way, under status quo, do not consent to individual missions, they consent to signing up to the military, and then the military sends them and deploys them on what they want to. So I think the point about consent that comes out at the end is moot in terms of which specific mission you support. Then they tell you they didn't politically consent. A number of responses to this. The first is that they didn't politically consent to really anything as regards being a member of that state, since the lottery of birth put them there as opposed to in the state where the intervention happened. But secondarily to that, I think that you don't politically consent to a number of policies that are expedient to the state and are still not allowed to just opt out of them because it's convenient for you. Like, it's probably convenient for me not to pay taxes, but that would do a great disservice to a number of people harmed by those things. I think that that's a problem. They tell you you need to be able to count on soldiers to do the thing that is best in the battlefield. They have assumed up and down their bench that the best thing is to fire the gun, and I think that Aislin's extension tells you a number of reasons why that's not the case. Sure.
Unpredictably not following orders because sometimes you feel overwhelmed by altruism is an incredibly ineffective way for the military to function. Also, when the government has a standing army of more soldiers, it probably is going to deploy them more frequently in more different places. You don't get better decisions.
So here are a couple of things with that, right? The first is the idea that they will deploy them more often. That's not true. The world's largest military is actually quite stationary. China just doesn't send soldiers willy-nilly everywhere. So I argue and contest on base that more soldiers means more deployments. Active militaries are the ones who spin narratives about why they need to be deployed. Second to that, though, is the idea that you can't count on them because they're going to decide haphazardly which times they take an action of protest on the battlefield. This is when I want to talk about my first theme, which is what kind of soldiers we get. Recognize that the reason that Aislin's extension talks about battlefield ethics as being particularly important as exhibited by these people who are conscripted and may or may not agree is a couple of fold. One, you will have enough training, right? The military has no incentive to send you in as someone who's just going to opt into doing whatever they want. There's a number of training things that mean that you won't always execute that preference, particularly when it would put your lives or other lives at danger. Secondary to that fact is the idea that the people who are most likely to conscientiously protest are the ones who care the most about saving lives. They are unlikely to jeopardize an entire battalion of their compatriots so that they can have the personal pride of saying, like, I protested that one time. I think they're going to exercise this rather judicially. Secondly, though, there are a couple of reasons why it's important to have these people on the battlefield that Aislinn talks to you about. One is that the command chain in militaries is responsive to situations on the ground. Policy does not change unless there are people telling commanders this isn't working on the field. That just happens less often when basic training in the military can effectively be done through predatory conscription practices to the people most likely to buy into the narrative that pulling the trigger is the most effective way to deal with that situation. Secondarily to that is Fish's POI, where he implies that, like, why can't they protest at home? Aside from the fact that they've never proved that discourse will be effective for their side, and I think that we don't need to depend on discourse on our side, you are just much more likely to get the discourse if there is something to talk about, i.e. someone protesting on the battlefield, than like someone putting daisies on the front lawn of the White House because they don't like the war that they're engaged in. Then they tell you that those who are elected to go to war, or sorry, who are elected will be responsible and that they are going to make these bureaucratic decisions are okay, right? So an answer to this is that those who are elected to go to war in status quo are unchecked in their violence precisely because they can depend on the narrative of you had enough information, right? Like when Aislinn tells you in her reputation that the bureaucracy not only is fallible but has an incentive to claim that everyone else had as much info as they did, that's not only a perverse narrative that you can't check without battlefield experience, you're also just less likely to get effective policy. Sure.
It's super unfair to instrumentalize these people, compromise their body rights, and send them off to war if they're pacifists only so that they can protest. But also if your concern is command structure and you're just cycling these people through the lower ranks, they're not going to change anything anyway.
I actually don't think that all of these people are only going to go to protest. I think a number of them will go because the military does things like have civil engineers or like have translators, so they will be in capacities where their protesting is a moot point and is irrelevant. Aislinn and I get more people who are more considerate about compassion in those roles on the ground as respected members of the military amongst people with guns. And I think that's the way that you change the narrative for people that are otherwise convinced by by the state. Finally, on states going to war. Aislinn tells you that there are a number of narratives that the state spins in order to convince people to stay in the military and to extend missions. All of these narratives are about violence and how that is the effective tool for solving in this instance. There is just less incentive to convince people that violence is necessary when you know you don't need to convince them, so they are more likely to come up with better justifications. I think that's important. Secondarily, though, support is disincentivized because those in power don't have to suffer, and you get that out of opening. What Aislinn uniquely tells you is that in addition to that, there is a reasonable type of blame on the battlefield, that there will be much more questioning of current combat methods, and that combat being carried out is outside the realm of public consideration and status quo. Very proud.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. We'll invite the opposition whip switch to complete this round in favor of the final 7 minute address. Your hearing.
Honorable Speaker, despite what Front Half says, there will always be times where government will need extended military interventions. When the proposition tells you, though, that this automatic public pressure can lead to the revolutionization of the Department of Veteran Affairs, I come back and tell them that that public pressure can also hinder the very missions that they will need to prevent genocide, for example, if that's the lowest burden that they want to take in this debate. But not only that, you hinder the ability for governments to do future missions, point where people might not elect governments now that actually are like military intervention, or actually are people that come out and say that these extended military interventions are something they would do when they get into office. 3 questions. First of all, will this make the war effort easier in terms of better for the military? Secondly, how will this impact the host country? And finally, how will this impact the soldier? Before going into yet, let's take a look at back half government. There are 2 things that back half tells you. The first is when Lex tells you, look, as a volunteer soldier, you also do not have consent, right? Like you're just sent and bartered around to different missions altogether. Here's the key distinction that you must note in this debate. When I'm a soldier, note this. When I'm a soldier and I voluntarily go into the military, I consent to the unpredictability of the military. I consent to the fact that I might have to go into these particular missions, as opposed to proposition, where that consent absolutely does not exist on any level whatsoever. So clearing that up, let's take a look at their extension. No thanks. They told you it's fine if you hesitate, for example, killing innocent children, because at the end of the day, battlefield ethics will get a lot better at the point where the discretion of soldiers are prioritized in being able to speak out against command. No thanks. First of all, Aislinn said there is a check on the battlefield. Right? At the point where there is a check on the battlefield, I don't see why these particular people, if they're so against the killing, for example, of innocent children or specific missions, I don't see why they wouldn't be the people that to actually take this back to their home countries when they're not having the system and also speak out about it on our side, right? And also try to go against the particular mission and raise their objections. No, thank you. But second of all, her response to me is, look, at the end of the day, it's better to have people on the battlefield because it's always going to be having like someone have the gun, right? Like someone will always have the gun and will always carry out that mission. I'll flip that on them and say that if you're a person, for example, on their side who is not willing to do that particular mission, there are also other people that are probably willing to do that as well. But second of all, in many cases, a split decision can be the be-all, end-all for a particular mission. You could compromise your life and the life of your comrades at the point where you hesitate to carry out a specific mission. There are literally missions where you have to go in and get out of there as quick as possible, and these are the very missions that proposition does not allow the military to put faith in their military in order to be able to do. No thank you. But third of all, I think it's highly offensive for the government to say that every person who voluntarily goes into the military is a trigger-happy psychopath. This is the team that stood for veteran affairs and labeled every person in the military as a person that I'm absolutely disgusted seemed to address. No thanks. Finally though, Lex comes back and says that command structures will listen to people on the ground. That's bullshit. Command structures listen to generals that order all of these particular actions that they're talking about. The real way you're going to be able to do this, as opposed to this possible timeout that generals are going to call and have a team huddle, that's not going to happen. The way you're going to be able to do that is public pressure that they themselves say can actually lead to tangible effects on the government and policy. So, okay, please. First question. Will this make the war effort easier? I'll take you later. First of all, Milton, think, never actually makes any direct link on why a smaller military is automatically better, and why a bigger military can automatically, like, in many cases, do a lot of things better, right? And that literally tells you that war has changed, where we have guerrilla groups, for example, where we have people, for example, that need task forces, as well as other tools like drone strikes and funding rebel groups, or doing a number of other things that the government is not likely to as focus on at the point where they have a surplus of people to choose from. No thank you. Lex tells you that fewer people in the military's task force is the very reason why it led to more people being put into the military and more predation happening, right? More people still do it, because at the point where we have more people within this particular military, there's less coordination, and all of those harms still exist on their side. No thank you. Then you tell from the government, they tell you this, look, is a check when you get wealthy individuals to come in, because it means that people will now send people to war more carefully. First of all, look, the influence private corporations have is highly exaggerated by opening government. But secondly, if it actually exists, I feel this very system they're proposing can also be abused. But finally, in many cases, we think even the rich then can oppose the very missions that they're talking about, right? The very missions that might send their children to have to go and cover up for a genocide or something might be the very missions that are not going to happen on their side. Right now.
So we can see we'll get some fewer good interventions. Let's weigh. On their side, Julia tells us that in the status quo, we don't even get the intervention in South Sudan for human rights. So we don't get much on their side. But on our side, let's look at drones. When there's no cost of war, we fucking drone strike everyone just to tell them there theoretically might be terrorists there, and 16-year-old males end up as the real definition of combat.
Okay, look, we can go back and forth on like whether or not the military at the end of the day is going to be able to fight these battles particularly well. But if their model is that they want to go over the worst situation possible, what we're saying is you're not going to be able to even have those in the future, or even sustain them at the point where public pressure is literally beholding the government to not being able to make decisions that they absolutely need to make in order to meet those particular concerns. Go for it.
Soldiers are given a lot of individual discretion when they're on the battlefield within the conflicts or within the constraints of those individual commanders. These people who are overly aggressive are not doing so in the command structure. They're oftentimes doing so outside of it, making mass human rights abuses, undermining the military.
But look, it is offensive to say that that's the majority of people there, right? We have practices within the military like court-martialing an individual that actively does all the shit they want to talk about. Second question, how will this impact the host country? The thing you get from OG is predation, right? Like, there's all like horrible things that the governments are doing to try to get people to come into war. First of all, look, Milton says the government's view towards ISIS is fear-mongering. That will still exist on their side, right? That actually shows that the people who are going into war on our side are the people who genuinely wanted to be there, because the fear-mongering that Milton says exists is happening right now. But second of all, look, if the issue is this entire problem, I think at the end of the day, a rich individual, when they come back from war, will be able to pay for all of these wonderful healthcare services, to be able to get better, to be able to come back and be fitter. In cases where you're talking about poor individuals, where they're actively sending people who might not even want to be there, they're not going to be able to have the resources to be able to come back and get that type of care that they want. And then they give you this ridiculous idea that veterans are all of a sudden going to get a lot better. At the point where that is true, I think public pressure, they can see, is highly instrumental towards determining policy. That is where you're going to see people not electing governments that want the very missions that OG wants to be able to handle, for all of you very
So we have to leave, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so panel B, I'll show you where downstairs, and thank you for round 1, 2016 round robin, Merit 100.